I'm here to call bullshit on empathy in design and research, with love. Thank you for being here with me, and shout out to the unmatched team at the UXR Collective. I'm Sekai Farai, and I'm an anthropologist that's been working as a researcher in technology since 2006. I've seen some shit, but still, I believe that technology focused on the intention of being good is the most efficient vehicle for delivering goodness in this world. Similarly, I believe that research, quality, thoughtful, disciplined research, can accelerate that goodness further. I believe with every earnest part of me that what we do with user research and product development is impactful and that we can change the world rapidly by steep degrees. I think we're underleveraged, overtaxed, and as a discipline, we've barely begun to discover as a discipline how to deploy user research to design the worlds we want to live in. Designing technology is world-making work. Because the stakes are high, I want to suggest to you that there's less empathy in user research today than there should be. I see the lack of empathy not just in your work, but also in my own. Over the course of my career, my research has powered the design of many dozens of consumer apps, fintech solutions, AI chatbots, floral technology, power tools. I've designed menstruation software, medical products, tools for subsistence farmers, and services for sex traffickers. I'm one of the best researchers I know. I'm one of the best researchers that a lot of people know. But when I'm really honest with myself, there's an awesome lack of empathy that goes into some of my best work. Now, if you can look at this with me, you might see that we rely less on empathy than we think. There's a persistent lack of self-awareness in user research today. And that lack of self-awareness, combined with the way user research is used, creates the empathy impossibility. There's an absence of empathetic people, there's an absence of empathetic processes, and there's an absence of empathetic environments. Those deficiencies taken together create the empathy impossibility. Now, I'm not here to take empathy away from you. I hope to inspire the desire to develop an empathic praxis that informs the output of your research efforts. The impossibility of empathy gives us an opportunity to get curious about what else is powering our work. It's an opportunity to do the work of becoming empathetic people, deploying empathetic processes in empathetic environments. That's the big job you've signed up for. Come with me. I'm going to talk a little shit today. I'm going to talk a little shit about technology. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about who I am and where I'm from. And then I'm going to tell you about the relationship between user research and anthropology. At the end of this, we're going to get into the belly of the beast and look at how empathy is impossible in your work. Now, I'll say it. Tech is really fucking it up. It's fucking up democracy. It's accelerating misinformation. Amazon is cannibalizing small businesses on their platform. Facebook violates their own policies for ad spend. Twitter placates Nazis. Uber creates economic precarity with the gig economy. Airbnb powers housing shortages. YouTube radicalizes white supremacists. Grubhub destabilizes the restaurant industry. Yelp is, have you seen what they're up to? Zoom tried to hold our privacy hostage during a pandemic. Tesla cosplays on whether autopilot should run over the dog or the black person. Palantir is surveilling us. 23andMe is sliding our DNA to the police. Nextdoor is helping our neighbors criminalize us, and so on. Now, don't get me wrong. The problem with these companies are solving are complex. Every major tech company has been in the news this month with this scandal. It's hard to look at the state of technology, its cumulative impact on the condition of the world, and to sit back and say, yep, these technologies are the outputs of empathetic work. When shit hits the fan and we discover a new way that tech has caused preventable and obscene harm, we call the engineers in the room and we ask, appropriately so, why did you build this? Then we call upon the designers and ask, how could you make this? But let's not forget the researchers. Let's call on the empathizing researchers, bring them to the front and hold them to account for the harm that their technologies have caused. Ask them, where did the empathy go? And I mean that in a literal sense. Where does the empathy go? My homestead in Zimbabwe is a small rural village. It's one of small homesteads that span over 45,000 acres of land. Our family works in cooperation with neighboring homesteads to produce about 75% of what we consume. We're pretty proud of that because it allows us to rely pretty heavily on a sophisticated bartering economy. It's imperfect, but it works. We're about 100 miles from the capital city, Harare. To get to the city, you need to walk a few miles, catch a few combis, and maybe hitchhike for the last leg. We're surrounded by dirt roads of red clay, the kind of clay that will catch your fabric and rub off on every surface you encounter through the day. We don't have running water, so we walk a few miles to get our daily water supply from the lake. There are no toilets, there's no electricity, there's no Wi-Fi. Just a bunch of villagers who used to be royals. Anthropologists have taken a sustained interest in village life, specifically traces of royal heritage, bride price, our laboa, burial practices, and our birthing traditions. From time to time, outsiders venture to the interior of village life to observe villagers in villages being villagey. They're typically white, they hang off to the side in the cut, and they wait for something tribal to happen. Observers on the periphery ask that we tell them our secrets, only for them to write books of our lives. This is some of the most obnoxious work you can do, and if I think about it long enough, I resent it. I developed a deep disgust for anthropologists, so of course I became one. Now, early anthropologists posited that societies emerge in a savage state and evolve into a more civilized condition. Now, that process of becoming civilized isn't natural. Today, we recognize that it's a process of exploitation and domination. Becoming civilized is a condition that occurs through intervention, typically of the colonial support. Anthropologists were exploiting the experiences of their contacted communities and leaving them with little in return. User research has a similar problem. While curiosity is the Trojan horse that anthropologists rely on to access those communities, but in user research, empathy can be a Trojan horse for exploitation. Now, that's not a cynical perspective. It's facing the condition of research and our work. There is no empathy in the capitalist production of technology. What there is, though, is observation, separation, exploitation, and domination. The industrial conditions of user research extinguish the empathetic instinct, sometimes outright, but sometimes through our pattern making, frameworking, and filtering. The empathy impossibility is a constellation of three related problems: the person doing the research, the processes for that research, and the environment of that research. As I said, the first problem is you, the researcher. Now, there are three deficiencies that most researchers have that contribute to the empathy impossibility. The first is a lack of diversity. User research today is incredibly homogeneous. Most of you represent the dominant culture across the majority of markers. The more aligned you are with a dominant cultural system, the less likely it is that you're able to experience empathy meaningfully. Now, for our purposes, imagine that the dominant cultural system is overwhelmingly white, heteronormative, ageist, ableist, and patriarchal. The more you represent or identify with the dominant culture, the less capable you are of seeing the problems caused by that culture. So what do we know about user researchers? We know they're abundantly white. We know they're abundantly privileged and abundantly aligned with the dominant culture. Study after study, we learn that white people have reduced capacity for empathy. This should shock no one. Study after study indicates that there's decreasing capacity for empathy the more income you earn. Many studies show that men trail women in empathic capacity. Another study shows that people with power have reduced capacity for empathy. We also learn that it's easier to develop empathy for people just like you, and there's a reduced capacity for empathy for those who are demographically dissimilar. Despite an abundance of evidence that most of you don't have the range of empathy, we comfortably anoint ourselves conveyors of empathy. It's an incredible lack of self-awareness, and it must be powered by an incredible amount of privilege. Another issue with researchers is that they lack empathetic fitness. Now, empathetic fitness is the condition of being ready and suitable for empathetic work. To be fit for empathetic work, you must be rested. And I mean that literally. You must be well rested. You must be supported. That is, you must have what you need to accomplish the work at hand. Empathetic fitness requires radical self-awareness, an ability to locate yourself, your biases, and your limitations within multimodal ecosystems. You must be meditative and mindful, with the capacity to clear your head on demand. Empathetic fitness requires explicit anti-racism. You must be critically, politically aware, fluent in the ways of wokeness. You must be open-minded, you must be courageous, you must be tough. And finally, you must be good. Extremely and measurably good. To develop empathetic fitness, you have to do the work to develop the necessary muscles. You have to be able to go from being clear-minded and empty-headed to being self-aware, then to being self-centered, and again, to be able to be absorbed in another person's experience. You must be able to do that in a matter of moments. Empathy for your work isn't a default condition. It's a readiness you develop, train for, and exercise to maintain that muscle. The final issue when it comes to researchers and their capacity for empathy is that there's a lack of empathetic endurance. You know how you might be in the middle of your morning commute, walking along the train platform, and let's say you see an unhoused person. You think, wow, this is so awful. It's so cold. He must be so afraid and uncomfortable. But then your train comes and you step over him and take your seat. That's what a lack of empathetic endurance looks like in our personal lives. Empathetic endurance is the ability to stay engaged in empathy long enough for it to matter to the person you empathize with. Now let's think about it. At work, you probably start in an apathetic state. But as we engage in the problem space, the apathy seeds. As we engage with users and learn more about their experience, you, theoretically, become more empathetic. At some point, the users leave the room. And so where does the empathy go? Does the empathy end? When the empathetic exchange is over, empathetic endurance ensures that you're acting with empathy on behalf of the user at every opportunity, most notably in the decision-making conversations. Empathetic endurance is what ensures that empathetic outcomes don't get scoped out of the work at hand. Without that empathetic endurance, you'll eventually devolve to apathy. Empathy can be codified in your decision-making frameworks. If you're really self-aware, you may begin to see the absence of a sustained empathetic impulse. Now, there might be some fleeting empathy, there may be flashes of understanding, but empathy in industrial research needs endurance if it's going to do what we say it does. If empathy is the mechanism that lubricates our research and informs our product development, that empathy needs to survive the interaction. Otherwise, we're only empathetic when the participant is in the room. And that's fair weather empathy. It helps no one, literally no one. Put simply, if you're like most user researchers, you're overrepresented by the dominant culture. You lack empathetic fitness, and you also lack empathetic endurance. Now, maybe you didn't know you needed those things. Maybe you didn't know they mattered, but now you know, and you can change your condition to create a true opportunity for empathy. So we've talked about you and why you specifically are a barrier to empathy in research. But it's not just you. It's also the fact that our research lacks empathetic processes. Many user research methodologies, interviews, ethnography, usability studies recreate a dynamic much like the one we see in the anthropologies of yesteryear. The dichotomy of the savage versus the civilized. Now, there's a distance in some user research, and that distance between you and your participant destabilizes the prospects for empathy. You, the researcher, have too much power in the room, and to get close to empathy, you have to give most of the power back. Let's talk about it. Now, what's the traditional civilized versus savage dynamic? Now, the civilized person is ordered, recognizable, predictable, knowable, attended to, thoughtful, developed, someone we can trust to watch and take note, an observer. And the savage is unruly, unpredictable, basic, obvious, undeveloped, natural, inelegant, impulsive, someone to be watched, observed. When you translate the civilized as the observer and the savage as the observed, here's what we see. We see an observer, the researcher, with a plan, a guide, hypotheses, questions, someone who has a desire to create order where there is the messy problem space. And then you see the observed, the savage, the participants, unguided, unrooted, emotive, reactive, unanchored. The problems that exist for anthropology when it comes to the civilized versus savage or observer versus observed also exist for user research. Put simply, When your methodology recreates the savage and the civilized, or the observer and the observed, you rely on your status as an observer and not the relationship. It's the relationship that creates the opportunity for empathy. Now, those methods that recreate the observer-observed dynamic are vast, and I think they comprise the most frequently deployed tactics for user research. Interviews, usability studies, diary studies, ethnography, all of these methods can be redeemed to make them better vehicles for empathy. Relying on your status as an observer is an outrageous power play that creates a separateness that undermines your capacity for empathy. Instead, develop the relationship with the participant so that it might be a vehicle for empathy. Adapt traditional research methodologies to be more dialogic, sharing the learning, sharing the teaching, sharing the working, and sharing the imagining. Close the gap between the observer and the observed by participating in the same way you ask of your participants. Now, there's another issue that gets to the lack of empathetic processes. User research pretends to be emic when it's really eidic. In anthropology, emic is from the view and the voice of the participant. Eidic is a perspective of the researcher, the observer. Now, in user research, we engage in the emic, but ultimately we deliver our findings from the eidic. Why? Well, we're trend hunters, pattern spotters, frame workers, capital producers. Now, I might distill my notes from one interview in the emic voice, but by the time I present my findings, I factored in a number of voices. I've extrapolated and filtered their voices out to deliver my findings from the eidic view. Data collection in the emic, data distillation in the eidic. The problem this presents for empathy is quite simply, empathy does not scale. I hope you're still with me. We've talked about a lack of empathy in the researcher. We've talked about the lack of empathetic processes. And finally, I want to discuss your environment, the business organization, and highlight for you that you don't work in empathetic environments, and this obscures the possibility for empathy. Empathy has economic value, and that economic value is unevenly distributed. Your empathy seeking is an effort to exploit someone's experience so you can extract value that is disproportionately handed off to the profiteers. That's what it means to do this work. That's what it means to learn about people's lives for the purposes of profiteering. Now, don't feel badly about this. Every form of exploitation endeavors to hide itself. Every form of exploitation has a sympathetic or compassionate cover. Colonizing anthropologists called it curiosity. Cruel enslavers called it care. Police call it protection and service. Capitalists call it competition. Engineers call it logic. Design calls it aesthetics. And research calls it empathy. We can't do this work empathetically if we can't acknowledge how the corporate environments we work in trade in anti-empathetic values. The sooner we confront this, the sooner we can adapt our methodologies to treat this reality. Now, I said it at the beginning of this talk, and let me say it again. There is no empathy in capitalist production of technology, observation, separation, exploitation, and domination. Thinking about your lack of empathetic environments, I want you to think about the power asymmetry. This also contributes to the empathy impossibility. I mentioned earlier that researchers have too much power in the room when they're in the room with participants. Here, the problem is that researchers have far too little organizational power to be able to drive empathetic outcomes. There can be no empathy when you don't have the authority to drive the business towards empathetic outcomes, the ones you discover are necessary in the course of your research. Now ask yourself, do you have the authority to put your business out of business? Probably not. Can you drive the organization towards an empathetic end that might deleteriously impact the bottom line? Still, probably not. When your environment doesn't have a commitment to the public good, there's no room for empathetic outcomes. We know that technology isn't neutral, and every day, technology takes over a greater share of our lives. Some tech companies are more powerful than governments, but without an outright affirmation for serving the interests of the public, your business will accept any opportunity that profits the profiteers. You need an organizational ethic of empathy. Your business has to want to be good. Because if it just wants to be a tool, a neutral technology, there's no release valve for empathy. There's nowhere for empathy to go. And that, I'm afraid, explains the condition of technology today. In many ways, empathy is a technology. And it's a technology that researchers use to bridge the gap between the observer and the observed. It's not some sweet, soft experience. It's not a value. It's not a skill. It's an extractive technology that cannot function in an environment that relies on domination and exploitation. Empathy is a conclusion. But for just a little while, let's stop talking about empathy. Show us your work. Show us how you became an empathetic person. Show us that you became empathetically fit. Show us that you've extended your empathetic endurance. Show us your empathic decision-making. Show us how your processes are empathetic. Show us how you got some power and created an empathetic organization from the top down. Show your work. And until you show your work, think about what else are you leaving on the table because you're busy talking about empathy? What aren't you talking about? Get curious about that. Explore that. Talk about that. In sum, the empathy impossibility exists where there is a lack of empathy in our personal constitution, a lack of empathetic processes, and finally, a lack of empathetic environments. Imagine what these technology companies would look like if the CEO was a user researcher. Researchers need decision-making power. We can run these companies. We can lead these companies. User research is world-making work. Let's do the work to make the world work, a better one. Before I close, I have to stop and acknowledge the condition of the world today, the virulent white supremacy that Black Americans have existed in for far too long. Each of us has to stop and consider how we've gone along for so long with these conditions. There should be a sense of shame, I think, and a sense of wonder and personal interrogation about why each of you hasn't done more to alleviate the conditions white supremacy has imposed on every aspect of the lives of Black Americans in every part of this country. I want you to think about who you are as a person who's able to endure with incredible privilege amongst so much suffering. And I want you to think about the work that you do. Really want you to dig deep and acknowledge the lack of empathy in your personal lives and in your professional lives. Thank you. I love you. Power to the people, power for the people, today and forevermore. Black Lives Matter.